PMS is among the most common health problems reported by women, affecting approximately 1 in 3, and there's not much modern medicine has to offer. Ancient traditional medicine, though, in Asia and Persia, used a spice called saffron to treat menstrual disorders, but what did they know? That was 3,500 years ago, in fact, the earliest recorded use of any medicinal plant. Didn't they know, though, that you can't really know anything unless it's put through a double-blind, randomized, placebo-controlled trial? Well, it took 3,500 years, but we finally have it. Women experiencing PMS for at least 6 months were randomly assigned to a capsule of saffron versus a capsule of nothing, and lo and behold, saffron was found to be effective in relieving symptoms of PMS. Check it out. Reported PMS symptoms significantly dropped even within the first cycle and continued to improve. This included changes in mood, anxiety, irritability, depression, nervous tension, mood swings, and feelings of being out of control, behavior, poor coordination, insomnia, confusion, headache, crying, fatigue, pain, aches, cramps, and tenderness, and other physical symptoms, including cravings and swelling, all thanks to a little spice from the saffron crocus. The spice saffron is composed of the female reproductive organs of the flower of the saffron crocus. Each flower just produces a few threads, such that you need 50,000 flowers to make a single pound of spice, enough flowers to fill a football field. So no wonder it's the most expensive spice in the world. Thankfully, in the double-blind, randomized, placebo-controlled trial of the efficacy of saffron on PMS, they found benefits using just a tiny amount. But what if you could get away with using even less, though? This has to be one of the wildest studies I saw published last year, the psychological and neuroendocrinological effects of the odor of saffron. I don't even know how they even thought up the idea to do the study. The purpose of the study was to clarify the effects of saffron odor on symptoms unique to women, such as premenstrual syndrome, menstrual pain, and irregular menstruation. Another double-blind, placebo-controlled study. How do you blind a smell study, though? Well, they diluted the saffron so much that you couldn't even smell it anymore. That's how little they used. So half the women sat there smelling nothing, and the other half sat there smelling nothing, except they were secretly being given an undetectable whiff of this flower. And here you go, significant drop in stress hormone levels and a significant improvement in psychological symptoms. Unbelievable. Smelling saffron is simple and easy, and it seems there is little side effect. In the double-blind, randomized, and placebo-controlled trial of saffron for PMS symptoms, the researchers also noticed a significant drop in symptoms of depression as well. Well, duh, it's probably because they just felt so much better, but researchers decided to put it to the test. Millions of Americans suffer from depression each year, a disabling disease that can even end up fatal due to suicide. Enter saffron, a double-blind, randomized trial, saffron versus Prozac. For 6 weeks, 40 outpatients diagnosed with clinical depression got capsules containing the spice saffron, or identical-looking capsules containing Prozac. Within just 1 week, a significant drop in depression symptoms that got better and better throughout the 6 weeks. One of those lines is the Prozac group, the other the saffron group, and as you can see, it doesn't really matter which is which, because they both worked equally well. Of course, 20% of Prozac users suffered from sexual dysfunction, an all-too-common side effect, whereas not one did in the saffron group. Patients and their families may view quote-unquote alternative medicine, that is, those treatments that are not traditionally taught in medical schools or generally practiced by clinicians, as being complementary or even superior to conventional medicine, but in the majority of cases there is simply no evidence to support that. But in the case of saffron, the evidence is growing. Every few years, the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention measures the level of chemical pollutants in the bodies of thousands of Americans from across the country. What did the latest report tell us about our toxic burden, or more importantly, that of pregnant women in the United States. Published last summer in the Journal of the U.S. National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences, here is the list of chemicals they measured on the left, and on the right is the percentage of women, both pregnant and non-pregnant, with detectable levels of these pollutants in their bodies. Look at those numbers. Most women in this country are contaminated with heavy metals, a number of toxic solvents, endocrine disruptors, fire-retardant chemicals, PCBs, and pesticides like DDT. And that's just the first page. Continuing on the next page, more pesticides, plastics, chemicals, industrial toxins circulating through their bloodstreams. Look at these numbers. In many cases, 99 or 100% of the hundreds of women tested were found with these chemicals in their bodies, and potentially passing them on to the next generation. On average, pregnant women harbored about 35 different chemicals. Each of these bars represents one woman. That's how many chemicals they found in their bodies. Bottom line, they found widespread exposure to pregnant women in the United States to multiple chemical compounds in their metabolites, including both banned and contemporary contaminants. Americans are walking chemical cocktails. So let us explore what consequences they may have and how to minimize our exposure to them. The official U.S. Presidential Cancer Panel report from the National Cancer Institute on reducing environmental cancer risk. What can we do now? That's what we need. We know there's a problem, but what can we do about it? First, to review, 1.5 million new cases of cancer a year, men, women, and children, and 500,000 deaths. With a growing body of evidence linking environmental exposures to cancer, the public is becoming increasingly aware of the unacceptable burden of cancer resulting from environmental and occupational exposures that could have been prevented through appropriate national action, especially children, who are considered more vulnerable than adults to increased cancer risk from virtually all harmful exposures. Unfortunately, the report concludes the grievous harm from this group of carcinogens has not been addressed adequately by the National Cancer Program. The American people, even before they are born, are bombarded continually with myriad combinations of these dangerous exposures. The panel urges you, Mr. President, most strongly to use the power of your office to remove the carcinogens and other toxins from our food, water, and air that needlessly increase healthcare costs, cripple our nation's productivity, and devastate American lives. Strong words, but what can we do? They don't give much dietary guidance. Basically, they just say choose organic and free range. Exposure to pesticides can be decreased by choosing, to the extent possible, food grown without pesticides and chemical fertilizers, and washing conventionally grown produce to remove residues. Similarly, exposure to antibiotics, growth hormones, and toxic runoff from livestock feedlots can be minimized by eating free-range meat raised without these medications if it's available. Avoiding or minimizing consumption of processed, charred, and well-done meats will reduce exposure to the carcinogenic heterocyclic amines and polyaromatic hydrocarbons. Unfortunately, they don't go into specifics in terms of which types of fruits and vegetables and which types of meat are the most contaminated. I assume they avoided going into detail so as to not to upset any particular agricultural sectors, but it does diminish the report's practical usefulness. Thankfully, though, there's a large body of new evidence now in which thousands of different food samples have been tested to help guide our day-to-day grocery store decisions, which we will cover next. There are some plant foods we may want to stay away from, such as cans of bamboo shoots imported from China. This was a study to evaluate the residues of organochlorine pesticides like DDT in Chinese bamboo shoots. Now, this was research carried out in China, and as I read the article, I couldn't help but get a distinct sense they were trying to downplay their findings. For example, they said only 9 pesticides were detected. This was their conclusion. While all sampled bamboo shoots contained these pesticides, most were safe for consumption. No thanks. What about food sources of BPA, a plastics chemical used for lining metal cans and in polycarbonate as opposed to PVC plastics? In humans, BPA is associated with cardiovascular disease, diabetes, and male sexual dysfunction in exposed workers. Food is a major exposure source, but there weren't any studies reporting BPA in U.S. fresh canned and packaged foods in the scientific literature until now. Before we get to what they found, what do they mean by male sexual dysfunction? The relationship between urine BPA level and declining male sexual function. Increasing urine BPA level was associated with decreased sexual desire, more difficulty having an erection, lower ejaculation strength, and lower level of overall satisfaction with sex life. This finding may have important public health implications given the widespread human exposure to BPA, but from where in our diet in particular? They measured BPA levels in over 100 fresh and canned foods, foods sold in plastic packaging, and in cat and dog foods in both cans and plastic packaging. Nearly all the canned foods were contaminated, from green beans to sardines, tuna and V8 to Chef Boyardee. There was only one fresh, non-canned food that had detectable levels, so if you don't buy canned foods or stick to BPA-free canned foods, the only food left to worry about appears to be sliced turkey. Measuring urine levels of industrial toxins is more useful than measuring food levels, since it indicates how much of the pollutants are actually absorbed into the body. So in one sense, it's telling you what kind of levels are circulating in your body. At the same time, it's telling you how much your body is successfully getting rid of through the kidneys. Ideally, we'd like to measure levels in human tissues, like how much is actually lodged in one's breast tissue, for example. Well, women get breast surgery all the time. Why not test surgical samples of removed breast tissue? Women get fibroids removed. We could test those too. Fresh autopsy samples. And hey, what about liposuction? How did the levels of polybrominated diphenyl ethers, flame-retardant chemicals, in the breast tissue of California women compare to various tissue samples taken from women around the world? Where do these flags fit? Which of these bars represents the levels found in Belgian women, Brazilian women, Californian, Czech, French, Hong Kong, Japanese, New Yorkers, Singaporean, or Spanish women? Do we wish they could all be California? No. Look at that spread, 2 orders of magnitude. The breast tissue of California women had nearly 10 times more than women in any other country, and compared to the lowest levels, autopsy samples of Japanese women, 100 times higher levels found in New Yorker liposuction. What are they eating in New York? I bet it's more than just Big Apples. You may remember me covering this study a few years ago, which showed that the primary source of flame-retardant chemicals in the American diet, with the exception of infants who get all the pollution straight from their moms, is meat, fish, dairy, and eggs. But which kind of meat is the worst? We didn't know until recently. We know that fish is the worst, and this was for halibut, which is actually one of the least contaminated. But in terms of other meats, second only to fish in terms of contamination, poultry, then pork, then beef. What's this one here, though, between chicken and fish? Turkey. So bottom line, white meat more contaminated with flame-retardant chemical pollutants than red, though the highest concentrations are actually found in dogs' and cats' food. What about polychlorinated naphthalenes? Until this study was published, information on the occurrence of these toxicologically significant industrial pollutants in food or on human exposure was sparse. PCNs are chlorinated polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, a potentially vast group of little-known environmental contaminants of human origin whose chemical structure can bestow a dioxin-like mode of toxic action. Say no more. Though banned in many countries, which aisle might we still find the most in the grocery store? The bread shelves? The dairy case? Would it be in the deli? The egg section? Fish counter? Or would it be in the produce department? The worst was fish, with the worst of the worst, farmed salmon, followed closely by organic salmon. Then comes poultry and eggs. Let's zoom in a bit here. Red meat has less, the worst being lamb. Then comes dairy, and at the bottom of the food chain, vegetables, fruit, and bread. So about 10 times less than meat, dairy, eggs, and about 100 times safer than fish, which gives us an idea of the route we may want to take through the supermarket. Just because mothers have a certain level of industrial pollutants in their fat tissue or bloodstream doesn't necessarily reflect what they're passing on to their child. So researchers last year decided to measure pesticide levels right out of umbilical cord blood. At delivery, as soon as you cut the cord, they squirt a little in a vial before they tie it off. 318 mothers studied, and even now, decades after it was banned, almost all umbilical cord blood samples, 95%, showed detectable DDT residues. Not exactly the first thing we want to be passing along to our newborns. The most common DDT residue found was a derivative called DDE, which was found most closely associated with the mother's consumption of 3 types of food. Because organochlorine pesticides are attracted to fat, they accumulate in foods of animal origin. Meat, fish, and dairy products were associated with the presence of DDE in umbilical cord serum. Though mothers continue to expose their babies to toxic pollutants, breast is still always best. But say earlier in life we were, God forbid, eating the standard American diet and ended up breastfeeding a certain amount of toxic waste to our child. If from then on out, after the birth or weaning of our child, we swear we've learned our lesson, we want to start a fresh page in our lives, start to eat healthy, and feed our new child only the best, how long might it take our children to shed the industrial toxins they may have gotten from us in the womb or from the breast? A recent study followed a cohort of children exposed at birth to PCBs from their mothers, tested at age 8, and then again at age 12 to get a sense of the half-life of these toxins within their bodies. Depending on which chemical pollutant, the estimated half-lives ranged from about 4 years to 9 years. So if our children eat a healthy diet, don't go play around in any toxic waste dumps, by the time they're between 20 and 45 years of age, they will have eliminated more than 95% of the PCB inheritance we gave them at birth, so it's not a lifelong thing. A problem they found in doing the study, though, is they had to throw out a lot of data, exclude children who had obvious PCB reuptakes because their levels were even higher at age 12 than 8. So regardless what kind of start our children got, it's never too late to improve our family's diets to prevent additional intakes of these pollutants into their bodies. What about perfluorochemicals, another persistent industrial pollutant, recently linked to thyroid disease? Though the highest levels were found in the United States, China comes in number 2. Where is exposure coming from? A little in dust and drinking water, but overwhelmingly meat and fish. Though, of course, our infants get it mostly from us. What about the dietary intake of PCBs and organochlorine pesticides in children and adults? Fish, fats, meat, cheese, eggs, dairy, poultry. Same sources for children. What about DDT? Again, mostly fish, Everything eventually kind of flows into the sea, though our children get a bit more DDT drinking milk than adults. And for those aching for a little hexachlorobenzene, it's conveniently packaged in these same foods. How many pesticides do you think our children are potentially exposed to? Well, here's the list in alphabetical order. This is just up to A. Why don't we just stop at T here? How do these chemicals get into our food supply? We've so polluted our planet now it just comes down in the rain, and can concentrate their way up the food chain. 8 different pesticides were recently reported contaminating the snow-packed tips of the Rocky Mountains. If they're contaminated, then everywhere is contaminated. So the best we can do is eat as low on the food chain as possible, plant foods, preferably organic. Not only do plant foods tend to have significantly lower levels of industrial pollutants because they're at the bottom of the food chain, there may be phytonutrients that combat the effects of some of these toxins. A group of scientists recently published a paper describing what happened when they ordered some dioxin from Dow Chemical, grabbed some DDT while they were at it, and dripped the chemicals on some human white blood cells with and without a variety of phytonutrients to see if they could have a protective effect. They identified 2 as the most effective agents in protecting human blood cells from developing these cell-toxic effects of dioxin and DDT. Here's a bit of their data. This is measuring inflammation triggered by dioxin. All 4 of these phytonutrients seem to mitigate the toxic effect, but zerumbone, found in ginger, and aruptine, found in citrus, appeared best at suppressing the inflammation. Now, this is obviously very preliminary. It was in a test tube, and they tested only a tiny fraction of the tens of thousands of known phytonutrients, but it does open up the possibility that plant-based diets may play a dual role in protecting us against industrial pollutants, reducing exposure, and potentially reducing some of the damage from many chemicals we're still exposed to, just given how polluted our world has become. For those of us starting new families, one of the myriad concerns that comes up is, how am I ever going to get my child to eat their veggies? And one answer, just discovered, is, ironically, to exclusively breastfeed as long as possible, apparently doubling the likelihood that they'll end up eating twice as many vegetables when they grow older. How could that be? The researchers suggest that breastfed babies, whose mothers regularly eat a variety of foods, are exposed to a diversity of flavors that are absent from formula milk, and this early exposure augments the acceptance of various flavors. So when our kids eventually eat some broccoli, instead of spitting it out, they'll subconsciously think, hey, I remember this. This could help explain these findings, summarized last year, suggesting that the longer babies are breastfed, the lower their risk of developing chronic diseases when they grow up. Babies fed formula, on the other hand, grow up to have higher rates of obesity, type 1 diabetes, type 2 diabetes, heart disease, stroke, asthma, twice the risk of developing celiac disease, gluten intolerance, more inflammatory bowel diseases like Crohn's and ulcerative colitis, and childhood cancers, including leukemia. They suggest a variety of mechanisms, stuff babies are getting too much of on formula, stuff they're getting too little of, leading to changes in their gut flora, hormonal and immune systems, which can set them up for problems later on. The latest Surgeon General's report agrees with the official World Health Organization recommendation, which agrees with the best available science, that all women in the world exclusively breastfeed for a full 6 months. Whether your own milk, a wet nurse, or a milk bank, there is simply no good substitute. It's the only formula for optimum health. There is one proven way to accelerate the removal of these toxins: transfer them to your baby. Changes in blood concentrations of PCBs during pregnancy. Some women cut their levels in half. They just deposited the pollution into their child. So much so that a significant predictor of pollutant levels in young people is their birth order. The firstborn gets first dibs on mom's toxic waste, leaving less for their baby brothers and sisters down the line. Same thing with breast milk concentrations. This is how much you have in your breast milk after your first pregnancy, but by the next few, you've already passed about 20% along to your firstborn. And even the mothers who were breastfed as infants tend to have higher levels in their breast milk when they grow up, suggesting a multi-generational passing down of toxic pollutants. So what women eat now may affect the levels of toxins in their grandchildren. This, of course, raises the question whether one should breastfeed at all, given the levels of PCBs in human breast milk. Researchers have long debated the adverse effects of exposure to PCBs on children versus the benefits of breastfeeding, and the conclusion is breast is still best. Breastfeeding should continue to be encouraged. So the best thing we can do for ourselves and our families, and their families, is to lower our dietary exposure as much as possible. Persistent organic pollutants like dioxins, PCBs, can persist for years in our bodies, but other dietary contaminants like antibiotic residues and some of the plastic compounds may be more of a matter of constantly re-exposing ourselves on a day-to-day basis. As suggested by this study recently, that measured changes in the levels of antibiotic and phthalate metabolites before and after a 5-day meat-free stay at a Buddhist temple. They tested participants' urine for the presence of a number of important antibiotics, such as Bactrim, enrofloxacin, Cipro, and although none of the participants were actually on antibiotics, the drugs were all found flowing through their bodies. But within 5 days eating vegetarian, the study demonstrated clearly that even short-term dietary changes could reduce the frequency of detection and levels of major antibiotics. Antibiotics detected in the urine were assumed to mostly originate from dietary intake, since participants with recent medication histories were excluded from the study. But see, they didn't know if maybe the drugs were in the water supply rather than the meat supply, but look, since they were all drinking the same amount of water, the study suggests that the contribution of drinking water may be negligible in the daily amount of antibiotics that are inadvertently consumed. To make sure, though, they did a follow-up study in which they actually tested for levels of antibiotic residues in meat, and indeed found that consumption levels of beef, pork, chicken, and dairy could explain the daily excretion amount of several antibiotics in urine, and the phthalate contaminants as well. Measures of oxidative stress dropped as well after the meat-free 5 days, but then again they were in a Buddhist temple meditating all day, so it's hard to tease out which did what. But the researchers concluded the results of this study suggest that dietary change, even in the short term, could significantly reduce dietary exposure to antibiotics and phthalates, and in turn oxidative stress levels in the general adult population. Concentrations of antibiotic residues vary between different edible muscle tissues in poultry. In which muscles do antibiotic residues concentrate the most? White meat, dark meat, or both the same? And the answer is white meat. Significantly more antibiotic residues in breast meat compared to thigh. Those were the only two tested, though, even though the present study found greater residue concentrations in breast versus thigh muscle tissues. The possibility also exists that other edible muscle tissues, like legs or wings, could have even higher levels. We know that the quality and quantity of fat is tightly correlated with the risk of our #1 killer, heart disease, but what about protein? out of Harvard recently, dietary protein and risk of ischemic heart disease in middle-aged men. Independent of source and independent of fat, do you think total protein intake was associated with more heart disease, less heart disease, or no difference? And the answer they found was no difference. The quantity didn't seem to matter. But what about the quality, the source of the protein? They observed no association between total dietary protein and the risk of total heart disease in this group of men. However, higher intake of animal protein may be associated with increased risk of ischemic heart disease in quote-unquote healthy men, meaning those without hypertension, high cholesterol, or diabetes, healthy only in quotes, though, given their higher risk of heart disease due to their consumption of animal protein. They also observed a significant inverse association between higher vegetable protein intake and risk of fatal heart disease, so more plants, less heart disease, meaning the more plants and fewer animals one eats would appear to be better for the heart, even independent of the fat issue. So the benefits of a plant-based diet may extend beyond just avoiding saturated animal fat. But isn't protein just protein, though? I mean, how does your body know if it's coming from a plant or an animal? Well, proteins are made up of a string of amino acids, and there are some amino acids more common in plants than in animals, particularly glutamic acid, which a study published in the Journal of the American Heart Association was found, for example, to potentially have independent blood pressure-lowering effects, which may contribute to the inverse relation between vegetable protein to blood pressure, meaning high plants, low pressure. Their data generally reinforce current recommendations for high intake of vegetable products as a part of comprehensive nutritional lifestyle approaches to preventing and controlling major established cardiovascular risk factors and epidemic cardiovascular disease. Ergothioneine is an unusual amino acid. It was discovered a century ago, but ignored until recently, when it was discovered that we have a transporter protein in our body specifically designed to pull it out of our diets into our tissues, implying that it plays some important physiological role. What does it do? Well, our first clue was the tissue distribution. It's concentrated in places where there's lots of oxidative stress, the lens of our eye, the liver, as well as really sensitive areas like bone marrow and semen. And so they thought it might be a cytoprotectant, a cell protector, and that's what they found. Not only does it get into the nucleus of our cells to protect our DNA, it can even get into our mitochondria, the power plants of our cell. Ergothioneine appears to function as a potent intramitochondrial antioxidant, which I've talked about before. Because we can only get it through diet, and the toxicity associated with depletion, when you starve cells of ergothioneine, they don't do so well, the researchers suggest that ergothioneine may represent a new vitamin. Well, we could certainly use all the mitochondrial protection we can get, so where can we find it in our diet? Well, it's not made by plants, not made by animals either, but by little microbes in the soil. Thankfully, we don't have to eat dirt. It's taken up through the root systems of plants and gets transferred to those who eat them, and those who eat plants, and so it ends up widely distributed in both the plant and animal kingdoms. That's true, but a little misleading. Yes, it's found in a variety of foods, but some more than others. It's not found in fruit, not found in dairy. Fish have up to 0.07, eggs have up to 0.7 in the yolk, twice as much in nuts and seeds, vegetables up to 3, grains up to 4. There's a bunch in organ meats, particularly the kidneys of pigs and the livers of chickens. Beans, however, up to 13.5. So, yes, technically in both plant and animal kingdoms, but not really evenly distributed. Any kingdoms we missed, though? There is a third kingdom of multicellular organisms. How could we forget? Fungus. Mushrooms are the superstars here, nearly 40 times more than the closest competitor. As I've talked about before, to help keep cancer-promoting growth factors like IGF-1 in check, we need to maintain an adequate but non-excessive protein intake. I talked about what was excessive, but what's adequate. We used to think that the average person needed about 0.3 grams of protein per healthy pound of body weight, or for those metrically minded, 0.66 grams per kilogram. So it was easy. You divide your ideal weight in pounds by 3, and that's how many grams of protein most people should average in a day, the so-called EAR, the estimated average requirement, but to be on the safe side, they recommended closer to 0.4 per pound for the RDA. Well, recently a group of researchers published a paper arguing that there may be fundamental flaws in the ways protein requirements have been calculated in the past based on some faulty assumptions. Taking that into account, the new recommendations from this group, based on this preliminary evidence, would be about 25% higher. They think most people now probably need about 0.4 grams per pound, and so to be on the safe side, shoot for 0.5. Well, at least that would make it easy to calculate. That would be half of our ideal weight in grams of protein per day, or about 1 to 1.2 grams per kilo. As Martha Rosenberg noted, the author of an excellent book, Born with a Junk Food Deficiency, just as this lithograph tells you everything you need to know about slavery, the fact that electroconvulsive therapy, electroshock treatments, were prescribed for menopause in the United States tells you everything you need to know about Western medicine's view about aging women. Here in this 1946 medical journal ad, amphetamines, speed, was recommended in conjunction with such fundamental measures as electric shock and estrogenic therapy. Doctors could throw in a little Thorazine too while they're at it. Hormone replacement therapy grew to prominence in the 1990s when millions of women were sold hormones from pregnant mare urine on the promise that it would prevent age-related diseases. But instead it may have caused them. Women on hormone replacement therapy suffered increased risk of heart disease, stroke, pulmonary embolism, and invasive breast cancer. They said it would help preserve women's memory, but may have in fact caused dementia as it shrinks women's brains. When the truth got out in 2002 and the number of prescriptions dropped, so did the rates of breast cancer, and horses got to walk around once again. Thanks to high-profile celebrity endorsements, though, interest then switched to so-called compounded bioidentical hormones from plant rather than equine sources, and advertised as not carrying the same risks. What does the science say? A bunch of new reviews on the subject out from the American College of OBGYNs, the Mayo Clinic, to the editors-in-chief of the Journal of the International Menopause Society, all concluded that bioidentical hormones, being bioidentical, carried the same risks, benefits, and side effects, which is not a good thing. And even worse, when the FDA actually analyzed them to see if the contents matched the label, nearly a third failed the analysis. Even in the same bottle, doses could be all over the place. OK, all universally opposed, but look, how do we know everyone just isn't in the pocket of the pharmaceutical industry, who just doesn't want the competition? Well, whenever I'm skeptical, I turn to the medical letter on drugs and therapeutics, considered to be one of the least biased sources in medicine. They're kind of like the Consumer Reports of the drug world, and in fact was actually co-founded by the co-founder of the publisher of Consumer Reports more than 50 years ago. As they like to brag on their website, the medical letter does not accept grants from any source, donations from anyone, funding from any entity. They won't let their work be used for promotional purposes, and they don't accept any advertising. They recently reviewed bioidentical hormones and came to the same conclusion. There is no acceptable evidence that bioidentical hormones are safe or effective. Patients should be discouraged from taking them. A number of recent documentaries have renewed interest in Gerson therapy, a largely diet-based alternative treatment for cancer invented by the late Dr. Max Gerson about 80 years ago. According to a recent review out of Sloan Kettering in the journal Oncology, for about $16,000 you can fly to a clinic in Mexico and spend 3 weeks consuming fresh, raw fruit and vegetable juices. OK. Eliminating salt from the diet, so far so good, and taking supplements such as potassium, B12, thyroid hormone, pancreatic enzymes, and supposedly detoxifying the liver with coffee enemas to stimulate metabolism. I do not dispute that coffee enemas would not be stimulating, but would not recommend them due to the whole "they could kill you" thing. To their credit, modern Gerson practitioners have moved away from the original tenets of the plan, which included feeding people raw calf liver smoothies after too many people died from systemic blood infections. After learning of the outbreak, staff at the Gerson Institute decided the policy of drinking blended liver was to be altered, and instead started injecting people with raw liver instead. But hey, conventional cancer treatments are no walk in the park either, right? You do them in hopes that they'll work. So how does the Gerson therapy compare? The first formal investigation in the treatment was back in 1947, and in the 65 years since, there's been about a dozen studies published in the scientific literature, and most came to the same conclusion, that Gerson therapy is useless or worse. The recent review dismissing Gerson therapy as useless or worse for the treatment of cancer was published before this landmark study came out, a head-to-head test of a Gerson-style regime versus the standard chemotherapy agent gemcitabine for pancreatic cancer, one of the deadliest of all malignancies. Being diagnosed with inoperable pancreatic cancer is basically, on average, being given a 6-month death sentence. The best modern medicine can offer is chemotherapy designed not to cure, but just to kind of slow down the death process and give people a few extra months. Since death is essentially considered inevitable, it offers an opportunity to try untested therapies, because what's the worst that can happen? Now, you'd think with all the interest in complementary and alternative medicine there'd be lots of these trials, but they're actually exceedingly rare and difficult to do. The National Cancer Institute and American Cancer Society should be commended for their efforts here. So, 55 patients, 23 chose chemo, 32 chose treatment with enzyme supplements, detox, and organic diet, composed mostly of raw foods. This may be among the first controlled clinical studies to compare allopathic, meaning standard medical, treatment to an alternative medicine program for a survival endpoint. What did they find? Well, first of all, before they even started, they agreed on what's called a stopping rule. If one therapy started working out way better than the other, then they just stop it, because it'd be unethical to continue. That point was reached, actually, and they had to stop the study prematurely because there were so many more deaths in the Gerson therapy alternative group. Here's the survival curve. Here's the chemo group. As you can see, despite conventional medicine's best efforts, about half were dead in a year. But here's the enzyme and raw food group. As you can see, they started dying off almost immediately, whereas those in the chemo group tended to be able to hold out longer. Yeah, but what about the quality of their lives in those in their last few months on Earth? Quality of life was significantly better in the chemo group as well. Conclusion. Among patients who have pancreatic cancer, those who chose gemcitabine-based chemotherapy survived more than 3 times as long, right? 14 months on average versus 4 months, and had better quality of life than those who chose the alternative proteolytic enzyme treatment. The skin is the largest organ in the body, about 20 square feet, and the most vulnerable organ in the body, exposed to both the oxidizing effects of UV radiation from the sun and the oxidizing effects of oxygen in the air. And years of oxidant stress can take a toll. Over the years, skin becomes thinner, more easily damaged, loses volume, elasticity, and can sag and wrinkle. What can we do about it? Skin wrinkling. Can food make a difference? They measured healthfulness of skin using a microtopographic method. It's cool. They make a mold of the back of your hand with a silicone rubber, peel it off, and then look at it under a microscope. This is what young, tight, healthy skin looks like, but then as we age, our skin can get all coarse and flaccid. How can we stop it? Well, three things contribute to the aging of skin: oxidative stress, induced by sun damage, inflammation, and ischemia, lack of adequate blood flow. Oxidative stress means we need antioxidants. Under these circumstances, many skin antioxidants undergo depletion, must be replaced continuously in order to delay the otherwise inevitable deterioration, which would lead to skin aging. So plant foods would presumably help. And then inflammation and lack of blood flow. And so one might predict saturated fat, inflammation, and cholesterol, ischemia, might be associated with adverse effects on our skin. Let's see if our predictions hold up. In particular, a high intake of vegetables, beans, peas, lentils, soy, and olive oil appeared to be protective against skin wrinkling, whereas a high intake of meat, dairy, and butter appeared to have an adverse effect. Prunes, apples, and tea appeared especially protective. A recent study, for example, found that green tea phytonutrients were able to protect skin against harmful UV radiation and help improve skin quality of women. After a few months on green tea, there was a 16% reduction in skin roughness and a 25% reduction in scaling. Here's a micrograph showing the reduction in scaling, as well as improved skin elasticity and hydration. Eating healthier can produce healthier skin, but people don't care about microscopic changes. What about overt, visible to the naked eye changes? The extent of facial wrinkles in the crow's foot area was determined by observation using the Daniell scale in 716 women. This is the scoring system they're talking about. It's a scale, 1 through 6, 6 being the worst. So, what seemed to help the most? In the present study, a higher intake of green and yellow vegetables was associated with decreased facial wrinkling. Those eating less than a serving of green and yellow vegetables averaged a score of 3. Those eating 2 or more servings a day averaged a 2. What really excited the researchers was the potential for these studies to promote a healthy diet. I mean, eating fruits and vegetables prevent cancer and heart disease, who cares? But wrinkles, on the other hand— A study published last year in the Journal of the American Heart Association linked TV watching with death. Television viewing time was associated with increased risk of all-cause and cardiovascular disease mortality. Video game playing, too. So, do you have to kill your TV before it kills you? Well, they don't think it was the TV itself, but rather a proxy for sedentary behavior. But of course, not all sedentary behavior is bad. Look, sleeping isn't. You can't get more sedentary than that. In fact, not getting a good night's sleep may be a novel and independent risk factor for obesity, for example. 43 studies reviewed, and the majority of forward-looking studies have associated spending much of the day sitting with a shorter lifespan. And what's crazy is that the time spent sitting was independently associated with total mortality, regardless of physical activity level. Right? Heart disease mortality was significantly elevated even in people who otherwise exercise regularly. So, just going to the gym after your desk job may not eliminate the risks of sitting around all day, something our bodies never evolved to do. So, if we can, we shouldn't sit down on the job and instead try thinking on our feet, whether high-tech or low-tech. Right? Consider a standing desk for reading the newspaper, watching TV, paying bills, whatever tasks we might otherwise do sitting down. Or, even better, slide a treadmill under there. Here's my crazy contraption. It's just lots of duct tape and bungee cords, basically. I can usually get in about a good 15 miles a day. Bottom line, we need to stand up for our health. the effects of a commercially available botanical supplement on strength, body composition, power output, and hormonal profiles in resistance-trained males. Something had a significant impact on both upper and lower body strength and body composition in comparison to placebo in a double-blind controlled trial. These changes were obtained with no clinical side effects, allowed these men to leg press an extra 100 pounds compared to placebo, and the magical substance was fenugreek, a naturally occurring edible spice that appears to double as an anti-cancer agent. Here's prostate cancer cells in a petri dish. Here's prostate cancer with a little fenugreek. Here's another type of cancer before and after. What about normal prostate cells, though? Before fenugreek and after. That's what we'd like to see. In summary, fenugreek seeds may possess potent anti-cancer properties. Cancer prevention is all well and good, but there is a side effect of fenugreek seed consumption. It makes your armpits smell like maple syrup. Analysis of human male armpit sweat after fenugreek ingestion, and yes, it happens to women too. In this study, the strong maple syrup odor, which appears after fenugreek ingestion, was investigated. They had men plaster some gauze pads into their armpits before and after eating a tablespoon of fenugreek seeds. Sweat was collected over a 24-hour period and given to a panel of 8 odor assessors to get their take. The experts described what they smelled in those armpits as cocoa, roast beef, carrots, spicy gravy, but then honey, rose, and lilac, peach like raspberry. I guess it could have been worse. There was one assessor who described one of the fenugreek odor compounds as musty sweet onion socks. Another agreed, but thought it was more like fruity floral socks. Of course, there was the boring assessor who was like, it smells like fenugreek? This is a harmless phenomenon. The only reason I bring it up is that there is actually a serious congenital disorder called maple syrup urine disease, branched-chain ketoaciduria. It's completely unrelated, but breastfeeding infants with moms using fenugreek to boost their milk production may be misdiagnosed. So, if you're breastfeeding and eating fenugreek, just make sure to tell your OB, just so they don't worry. A group of Russian scientists recently published a database of the antioxidant content of more than 1,000 foods, including, for the first time, an impressive array of before and after shots of what happens to seeds when you sprout them. As you can see, the antioxidant content goes up across the board. So sprouted lentils, for example, had twice the antioxidant content as unsprouted. Chickpeas, 5 times more. Wheat and rye, 10 times more. And amaranth started out as the piddly underdog, but went up 20-fold. Recently, meat industry groups launched a new PR campaign to quote-unquote crush myths about meat, countering, for example, the notion put forth by the World Health Organization, American Academy of Pediatrics, American Public Health Association, etc., that antibiotics fed to livestock by the truckload poses a human health risk. These are the drugs approved for use in farm animals, and they're fed to farm animals by the millions of pounds a year to promote growth and prevent disease in the stressful, overcrowded, unhygienic environments they may be confined in these days. The PR people scoffed at the Union of Concerned Scientists' estimate that as much as 70% of antibiotics produced in the U.S. go to livestock. Now, the reason it had to be estimated, of course, is that the industry refuses to release the true numbers. But look, it's the best we had. But it is a statistic the Mythbusters claim cannot possibly be calculated, considering that antibiotic use in humans is not tracked. Turns out, as with much in meat myth-making, this simply isn't true. That data is tracked by the FDA Office of Surveillance and Epidemiology, as pointed out by the Johns Hopkins School of Public Health Center for a Livable Future. So was it really 70% of antimicrobial drugs going to farm animals, like the Union of Concerned Scientists claimed, or was this just a myth to be crushed? And I have to say, according to the latest available data, the meat industry is right. It's not 70% going to farm animals, it's closer to 80%, more than 28 million pounds a year. But then again, why listen to the American Medical Association when it comes to your health, when you can listen to the American Meat Science Association? Reported for the first time recently case reports of aspartame-induced fibromyalgia, an unusual but curable cause of chronic pain. 50-year-old woman had been suffering from widespread pain and fatigue for more than 10 years, leading to the diagnosis of fibromyalgia. But during a vacation in a foreign country, she did not suffer from painful symptoms, and made a connection with the fact that she had forgotten to take her aspartame. All the symptoms reappeared in the days following her return when she reintroduced aspartame into her daily diet, but when it was definitively excluded from her diet, resulted in a complete regression of her fibromyalgia symptoms after 10 years of suffering. 43-year-old man consulted for a 3-year history of bilateral forearm, wrist, and hand and neck pain, various unsuccessful treatments. A detailed questioning followed to find out that he had been taking aspartame for 3 years. The removal of aspartame was followed by a complete regression of pain without recurrence. The benefit-risk ratio of considering the diagnosis of aspartame-induced chronic pain is obvious. The potential benefit is to cure a disabling chronic illness, right? To spare numerous laboratory and imaging investigations, and to avoid potentially harmful therapies. The potential risk is what? To temporarily change the patient's diet? Thus, practitioners should ask patients suffering from fibromyalgia about their intake of aspartame. In some cases, this simple question might lead to the resolution of a disabling chronic disease. And fibromyalgia is no small pain in the neck, affecting an estimated 5 million Americans who should all be asked that simple question. When we learned how bad butter was, the food industry responded by giving us margarine, which turned out even worse. When dietary guidelines told us to lower our fat intake in hopes we'd pick up an apple, the food industry gave us fudge-drizzled chocolate chip cookies. Similar reasoning led to the billion-dollar diet soda industry, now with vitamins and minerals. Intake of artificially sweetened soft drinks and the risk of preterm delivery. A prospective cohort study in 59,334 pregnant Danes. Conclusion: daily intake of artificially sweetened soft drinks may increase the risk of preterm delivery. And it probably wasn't the caffeine or other additives, since the same sweetened versions of the soda did not result in the same problem. So what is it? They think it's the aspartame. After ingestion, aspartame is broken down to methanol, wood alcohol. Methanol is oxidized into formaldehyde, which isn't great stuff. This might be one factor explaining reports of headaches linked to the intake of aspartame. Researchers suggest that the observed shortening of pregnancy could either be related to the effects of methanol on the fetal neuroendocrine system, or an indirect action on the mother's uterus. The only non-toxic, non-caloric, or low-calorie sweetener may be erythritol. For a while it was only available in Japan, but now it's pretty much available everywhere. It's found naturally in pears and grapes, but industrially we just have yeast make it for us. It doesn't cause cavities, and it hasn't been implicated in fibromyalgia, preterm birth, headaches, hypertension, brain disorders, platelet disorders. In videos in years past, I've talked about erythritol as being harmless, but new data suggests I may have to change my tune. Now it actually may be helpful. Adding to its role as a low-calorie, tooth-friendly bulk sweetener, erythritol may be a sweet antioxidant. This shows the dose-dependent protective effect of increasing concentrations of erythritol on the oxidative destruction of red blood cells. The reason they even look for antioxidant activity is because structurally it looks like mannitol, a well-known antioxidant. The problem with mannitol and the other polyols, such as xylitol and sorbitol, is that they aren't absorbed, and so can cause gastrointestinal symptoms lower down in the colon. Safety studies suggest that erythritol, however, is well tolerated, shows no sign of toxicity, is therefore an excellent sugar substitute, for example, for individuals with diabetes, because it can both replace sugar and maybe even help reduce free radical formation. They're both expected to reduce the onset and progression of painful and life-threatening diabetic complications. Erythritol, the too-good-to-be-true non-toxic, low-calorie, tooth-friendly sweetener that may even act as an antioxidant, what's the catch? Well, there are three ways that all non-caloric sweeteners could theoretically be harmful independent of their specific chemistry. Over the years, several large-scale prospective cohort studies found a positive correlation between artificial sweetener use and weight gain, meaning the people that drank the most diet soda, for example, gained the most weight. Now, the most common explanation for this counterintuitive finding is what's called reverse causation. And people aren't fat because they drink diet soda, they drink diet soda because they're fat. But there are at least three other less benign alternative explanations. The first is called overcompensation for expected caloric reduction. If you covertly switch someone's soda for diet soda without them knowing it, their caloric intake drops. Obviously, they're not drinking all that sugar anymore. But what if you tell them what you did? People who knowingly are consuming artificial sweeteners may actually end up eating more calories. Why? Because they're like, hey, I'm drinking diet soda, so I can have 2 pieces of cake. Okay? In this study, they gave people an artificially sweetened cereal for breakfast, but only told half of the group what they did. As you can see, when it came to lunchtime, the aspartame-informed group ate significantly more than the aspartame-naive group that didn't know any different. Other than overcompensation for expected caloric reduction, there are 2 other ways that even the most non-toxic non-caloric sweetener could still be harmful if we're not careful. When our brain registers the sensation of sweetness on our tongue, it has millions of years of evolution telling it we just put a piece of fruit in our mouth, and so your brain yells, eat it, and boosts our appetite, because the only naturally sweet things on the planet are super healthy, right? Fruit, sweet potatoes, beets, right? You drink a can of diet soda, and your brain thinks you just stumbled across a wild blueberry bush or something, and sends urgent signals to consume before someone else gets wind of our bounty. Right? Now, your body's not stupid. It knows if you eat too many calories of any food, you might get fat and not be able to outrun some saber-toothed tiger. So there are signals that come up from our gut when we absorb calories into our system, telling us eventually to, OK, slow down, we've had enough. But with non-caloric sweeteners, we have a disconnect. We just have the appetite-boosting effects on our brain of the sweet nerve sensations from our tongue, but without the appetite-suppressing effects of the calories coming into our system. And so this revved-up appetite may lead us to overeat more than we would have without the diet soda, and end up gaining weight. The third way artificial sweeteners may counterintuitively lead to weight gain involves maintaining the cravings of and dependency on all things sweet. By continuing to consume any sweeteners, with or without calories, we are unable to train our flavor preferences away from intensely sweet foods. It's like if you go on a low-salt diet. For the first few weeks, everything tastes like cardboard, until your taste buds have a chance to adapt to the new norm. After that, naturally low-sodium foods taste perfectly fine, and adding table salt tastes gross because it's way too salty. Same thing with sweeteners. At home, maybe use erythritol. That's great. But then you go on vacation, what if you forget it at home? You still take your preference for intensely sweet food with you, and that may end up translating into the increased consumption of less than healthy food. So those are the caveats. Even for something non-toxic like erythritol, it's safe, but only if you don't use it as an excuse to eat more junk food. When people get heart or kidney transplants, they must be given immunosuppressive drugs to prevent rejection of the new organ. What do you suppose happens to cancer rates in those individuals who are immunosuppressed? Well, for some types of cancer, like skin cancer, the risk goes up, which supports the so-called immune surveillance hypothesis, the idea that our immune system acts as a natural defense system for keeping cancer under control. This could explain why, as we age and our immune function declines, our risk of cancer goes up. Here's a video of our immune system in action. That big oval cell in the middle is a cervical cancer cell, and those little round cells are our T cells delivering the poison pill, setting off the cancer cell's self-destruct mechanism. And there it goes. Bye-bye, cancer. That's the apoptosis, or programmed cell death, that I'm always talking about. Note this so-called renaissance of the immune surveillance hypothesis was more than 10 years ago. The problem with the theory is that for some cancers, immunosuppression decreases cancer risk. After a kidney transplant, your skin cancer risk may go up, but your breast cancer risk goes down. Your rectal cancer risk goes down. Why would people with depressed immune systems have less cancer? This led to a new theory, kind of the flip side of immune surveillance. The thought that in some sense cancer may be considered an autoimmune disease. See, the only reason the immune system is even able to pick out cancer cells from non-cancer cells is because tumors express foreign-looking antigens, immune-stimulating molecules. Why would tumors do that? Why would cancer cells go out of their way to wave a red flag around saying, "Hey, come get me"? We think it's because cancer tends to thrive in a setting of low-level inflammation. There's lots of examples of chronic inflammation leading to cancer, like ulcerative colitis to colon cancer, chronic pancreatitis to pancreatic cancer, chronic hepatitis turning into liver cancer, stomach inflammation to stomach cancer. Oftentimes, inflammation, the body's immune response, can further cancer's agenda. By inciting an immune response, cancer creates its own inflammation, which may stimulate angiogenesis, help bring blood to the tumor, and help it grow. So the curve may look something like this. A low level of inflammation stimulates cancer growth, but if the immune system really catches on, then it can actually start hacking away at the tumor and slow it down. This may explain a mystery surrounding Kaposi sarcoma, a cancer affecting those with AIDS. When you start treating AIDS and the immune system starts to recover, you can actually see a flare in the cancer. To understand the dietary implications of the new autoimmune theory of cancer, we must first have to understand how the immune system works. This was one of the greatest mysteries in all of biology, solved by a brilliant scientist who won the Nobel in 1960 for figuring out the clonal selection theory of immunity. Each one of our antibody-producing immune cells, called B cells, produces only one type of antibody. Antibodies are one of the main weapons our immune system uses to attack foreign invaders, and they're specific. It's not like we have one B cell that covers grass pollen and another that covers bacteria. We have a B cell in our body whose only job is to produce antibodies against the pollen of purple Siberian onion grass, whether or not we ever come in contact with it. Another whose only job it is to make antibodies against the tail proteins of a bacteria that lives only in the thermal vents at the bottom of the ocean. Wait a second. There must be like a billion different things in the world. If each of our B cells produces only one type of antibody, then we'd have to have like a billion different types of B cells. And we do, which is totally amazing. So, Let's suppose one day you're walking along and get attacked by a platypus. They actually have poison spurs on their heels, you know. And so for your whole life up until that point, the B cell in your body that produces antibodies against duck-billed platypus venom was just hanging around, twiddling its thumbs until that very moment. As soon as the venom is detected, it raises its hands and says, me, starts dividing like crazy, makes copies of itself, and soon you have a whole swarm of clones specialized for platypus poison protection, fending off the toxin, and you live happily ever after. That's how the immune system works. How is it our immune system is able to distinguish between self and non-self? How does our immune system know what to attack and what not to attack? As I described, the clonal selection theory of immunity suggests that we start out able to fend off basically every cellular structure in the known universe, because we have 1 billion different types of antibody-producing B cells, each capable of recognizing a different molecular signature. Why then do we tend not to attack ourselves? It's because before we're even born, we kill off each and every B cell that recognizes us. It's called clonal deletion, the killing off of forbidden clones. That's what our thymus gland is for. When we're still a fetus, our body lines up all our immune cells, our B cells, our T cells, holds up a picture of ourselves and asks them one by one, do you recognize this person? And if any of our immune cells say yes, they're shot in the head, killed on the spot, death by apoptosis, and good riddance. Turns out this process of clonal deletion, ridding our bodies of self-recognizing immune cells, happens throughout our lives, mostly in our bone marrow. If you remember, though, as I talked about before, IGF-1, the cancer-promoting growth hormone boosted by animal protein consumption, prevents apoptosis, prevents our body's killing of cells it wants to get rid of. That may be why IGF-1 levels are linked to cancer. So it is of great interest to determine whether IGF may be contributing to the inappropriate survival of lymphocytes in autoimmune or inflammatory conditions. Maybe that's why people who eat plant-based diets appear protected from autoimmune diseases, explaining, for example, the extraordinary rarity of most autoimmune diseases among, for example, sub-Saharan rural blacks following a traditional vegan lifestyle. Before they changed their diet, evidently not a single case of multiple sclerosis had been diagnosed among a population of 15 million. For those of you who've been following my work since the beginning, you remember back in 2003, I covered this landmark paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, Human Intake and Incorporation of an Immunogenic Non-Human Dietary Sialic Acid. If you take autopsy samples, you can find proof of a molecule called NuGC in human tumors. You can see it stained brown here in human breast cancer, melanoma, ovarian cancer, brain tumors. Now this mystified researchers because human beings are genetically unable to produce this substance. But other animals can. Maybe, the researchers proposed, human beings absorbed it from eating other animals. Well, to test this, because it's found in animals and animal products, the researchers had to first eat vegan for a few days to clear their system, no animal-derived ingredients in foods or drugs or shampoo. And then they basically drank a glass of diluted pig mucus, and within days this invading meat molecule could be found oozing from their bodies, in their saliva, urine, even their hair clippings. Because NuGC-type compounds are not found in plants, and NuGC is not synthesized by microbes, the dietary source of NuGC must be foods of animal origin. The metabolic incorporation of this molecular Trojan horse, if you will, from animal products may possibly be contributing to the higher rates of cancer and heart disease among meat eaters. This is what they think may be happening. Comes into our mouths from animal products in our diet, incorporates itself into our cells, leading to chronic inflammation directly, and the formation of antibodies, which that can then lead back to more inflammation, which may partially explain the increased risk of cancer and heart disease noted in those consuming animal products. In contrast, vegetarianism decreases the risk of cancer and heart disease, although saturated fat in meat and dairy products is the usual explanation for that fact. Maybe we should start looking into the association between Nu-GC and the incidence of both cancer and ischemic heart disease. And hey, what about autoimmune diseases like rheumatoid arthritis? Maybe that's why vegetarian diets seem to improve rheumatoid arthritis. Maybe that's why you don't see rheumatoid arthritis in other great apes. Right? Maybe the incorporation of this reactive kind of alien molecule into inflamed tissue, such as arthritic joints, could potentially be aggravating arthritis. But you take animal products away, and within weeks, rheumatoid sufferers may feel better. We are now finally able to understand how tumors are able to trick our immune system to feed them with inflammation. When we're born and grow up, we have immune cells that attack everything but us, because the ones that recognized us were eliminated. Cancer cells may be mutated, but they're still our cells, so how do they get the immune system's attention? Presumably any B cell that would recognize us was killed off before our birth. That's where xenoautoantibodies come in. Xeno means foreign, as in xenophobia. Auto comes from the Greek autos, meaning self, as in automobile, a self-moving vehicle, no horse required. But how can something be both xeno and auto, foreign and self? Though many tumors, like breast cancer, thrive on inflammation, thrive on this low-grade immune response, the problem for the tumor is that since it originated from normal breast tissue, it doesn't look foreign to the immune system, so the tumor isn't able to evoke the response it needs and wants. That's where Nu-GC comes in. Evidence for a human-specific mechanism for diet and antibody-mediated inflammation in carcinoma, cancer progression. See, Nu5GC incorporation by the cancer confers a selective advantage to tumor cells that are best at accumulating Nu5GC. By actively accumulating this foreign meat and dairy molecule coming from our diet into the tumor, the cancer may use it to trick our immune system into producing autoimmune antibodies, anti-Nu5GC autoantibodies, which leads to the release of inflammatory compounds that enable the cancer to grow faster. The combination of tumor-associated Nu5GC and our circulating anti-Nu5GC autoantibodies promotes tumor growth by inducing weak inflammation, causing infiltration of inflammatory cells, and enhancing angiogenesis, enhanced blood flow to the tumor. Our own tumors use what we feed on to get what they feed on. So, as I talked about before, since cancer, in a sense, may be now considered an autoimmune disease, what are the dietary implications, given the fact that most animals produce this tumor promoter? Well, we don't make Nu5GC, at least we haven't for a few million years, and neither do plants. So to undermine our tumor's sneaky strategy, I guess it comes down to either cannibalism or a plant-based diet, or both, I guess. Importantly, these data are congruent with the decreased cancer risk associated with veganism. The foreign meat molecule Nu5GC tends to accumulate particularly in the lining of hollow organs, where carcinomas like breast cancer develop inside your glands, and in the lining of blood vessels, where atherosclerosis occurs. Evidence for a novel human-specific xenoautoantibody response against vascular endothelium. The Nu5GC accumulation may facilitate production of anti-Nu5GC antibodies and further aggravate chronic inflammation in atherosclerosis progression, in addition to just aggravating cancer. Here you can see it stained in red, lining the aorta of a human autopsy sample, and here you can actually see it inside atherosclerotic plaques, providing multiple pathways for accelerating inflammation in this disease. Remember, we lost the ability to make this substance millions of years ago. Whether it's feeding inflammation to our cancer or to our heart disease, it all came from the animal products in our diet. Taken together, these findings suggest a mechanism whereby anti-Nu5Gc antibodies can initiate, perpetuate, and/or exacerbate an inflammatory response at the endothelium, the lining of our arteries, potentially playing a role in disease states such as atherosclerosis, where vascular inflammation is involved. Nu5Gc is a novel, dietary, and human-specific xenoautoantigen that may exacerbate a variety of vascular pathologies. They go on to note that if we actually ate what the USDA recommends for protein in the form of meat and dairy, we could ingest as much as 10 milligrams of Nu5Gc per day, which is 10 milligrams more than we evolved to have in our bodies, since as a species we stopped making it millions of years ago before we started eating meat. Novel therapeutic approaches to reducing or dampening flares of immunologic responses against the endothelium could include reduction of dietary Nu5Gc intake and accumulation through simple diet-based interventions. Well, not so novel, perhaps, but definitely simple. This inflammatory cancer promoter has never been reported in plants. Beyond the putative role of non-human Nu-GC as a potential molecular link between diet, autoreactive antibodies, and the progression of human cancer, let me offer one final tidbit on the evolving Nu-GC story. The potentially deadly toxin produced by E. coli 015787 that causes the hemolytic uremic syndrome that can shut down the kidneys of children actually attaches to Nu-GC. When we eat animal products, the assimilation of dietary Nu5Gc creates high-affinity receptors on the human gut lining and kidney blood vessels, conferring susceptibility to the gastrointestinal and systemic toxicities of the E. coli toxin. Ironically, the same foods rich in Nu-GC are the most common source of contamination with these toxin-producing E. coli. So meat provides us with the receptors to the very toxins the meat may contain. It's like a gunman handing us our own bullseye. So there are both long and short-term consequences. Taken together, these findings suggest a two-hit process in the pathogenesis of human E. coli-induced disease. First, humans eat Nu5Gc-rich food, leading to incorporation of Nu5Gc on the surfaces of their cells. Second, when exposed to a toxin-producing strain, the toxin produced will be able to bind to the intestinal epithelial cells, perhaps causing acute gastrointestinal symptoms, and eventually damaging endothelial cells in other organs like the kidney, thereby causing HUS. Nu5Gc-rich foods not only sensitizes human tissues to the toxin, but also simultaneously increases the likelihood of infection with toxin-producing E. coli. These pathogens are usually found in the intestines of livestock, and as such, most commonly enter the human food chain by fecal contamination. Thus, those who consume large amounts of these types of foods may be unwittingly preparing their bodies for damage by a toxin-producing organism that contaminates their next meal of the very same food types. The researchers ask, is this poetic justice for meat eaters? Not when it's a major cause of acute life-threatening kidney failure in children. If you take any plant, burn it to ash, throw the ash in a pot of water, stir it around, skim it off, and let it evaporate, you'll be left with a white residue at the bottom known as pot ash, used since the dawn of history for everything from making soap, glass, fertilizers, and bleach. It was not until 1807, though, when a new element was discovered in the so-called vegetable alkali in pot ash, so they called it potassium, potassium, true story, which I bring up only to emphasize the most concentrated source in our diet, plants. Every cell in our body requires the element potassium to function. For much of the last 3 million years or so, we ate so many plants that we got 10,000 milligrams of potassium in our daily diet. Today, we'd be lucky to get 3,000. Less than 2% of Americans even get the recommended minimum adequate intake of 4,700 a day. To get even the adequate intake, the average American would have to eat like 5 more bananas worth a day. 98% of Americans eat potassium-deficient diets, primarily because they don't eat enough plants. A review of all the best studies ever done on potassium intake and its relationship to two of our top killers, stroke and heart disease, was recently published in the Journal of the American College of Cardiology. A 1,600 mg per day higher potassium intake was associated with a 21% lower risk of stroke. That still wouldn't get the average American up even to the minimum adequate intake, but may still be able to wipe out a fifth of their stroke risk. These results support recommendations for higher consumption of potassium-rich foods to prevent vascular diseases. What does that mean, potassium-rich foods? Potassium is particularly abundant in fruits and vegetables. A greater fruit and vegetable consumption has already been shown to protect against occurrence of stroke. According to another meta-analysis, 5 or more servings of fruits and vegetables per day associated with a quarter lower rate of stroke compared with 3 or fewer servings. And it's not just bananas. Chiquita must have had some great PR firm or something. I don't know why that's like one of the only things people know about nutrition. In reality, bananas don't even make the top 50 sources, coming in at number 86, right behind fast food vanilla milkshakes, and only then bananas. In reality, the top 5 sources are tomato and orange concentrates, and then in terms of the best whole foods, greens, beans, and dates. Potassium is best known for lowering blood pressure and stroke risk, but a randomized double-blinded, placebo-controlled trial of potassium supplementation was tried in patients with rheumatoid arthritis, published in the Journal of Pain. Rheumatoid arthritis is kind of the classic autoimmune inflammatory arthritis. Sufferers tend to have inappropriately low glucocorticoid levels, which are circulating steroid hormones like cortisol that suppress inflammation, and so low levels may allow for more inflammation. Glucocorticoids also help our kidneys excrete potassium, and so when we eat a lot of potassium, our adrenal glands secrete more glucocorticoids so we don't build up too much. And so maybe if you gave people with rheumatoid arthritis some extra potassium, it would boost steroid levels and help with the inflammation. So they bumped their daily intake up to 6,500 a day. Still not reflective of our evolutionary heritage, but at least they were making the cut for adequate intake. And indeed, higher potassium intake was associated with an improvement in rheumatoid arthritis and a lower disease activity and pain intensity, reflecting an anti-pain effect for potassium. And so they suggest planning a successful dietary regimen, including much more use of leafy vegetables. Those placed on a plant-based diet experience a significant increase in potassium intake, though even those eating vegan aren't eating enough greens on average. Maybe that bump in potassium helps explain why plant-based diets are so effective at treating rheumatoid arthritis. If this is the mechanism, though, if potassium-rich foods boost natural anti-inflammatory hormones in the body, then it should work for other inflammatory conditions too, right? Well, that's exactly what was suggested recently. Some studies have shown vegetarian diets improve psoriasis symptoms, for example. Maybe this is why speculating a cortisol-potassium theory is a novel mechanism for the beneficial effects of vegetarian diets. Metabolic syndrome, also known as Syndrome X, is a medical disorder characterized by the so-called deadly quartet: abdominal obesity, high fasting sugars, high triglycerides, and high blood pressure. and it sets people up for a non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, stroke, diabetes, cancer, and heart disease. It's been estimated to afflict about a quarter of the American population. How do we stop it? How do we prevent it? Well, if it's all about obesity, the level of fat in our blood, and high blood pressure, then that seems like a job for plant-based nutrition. We didn't know for sure, though, until recently. Even after adjusting for lifestyle factors such as smoking and exercise, risk was highest in those eating non-vegetarian, intermediate risk for those eating semi-vegetarian, and lowest in those eating vegetarian, cutting the odds of having metabolic syndrome by more than half. An analysis of a bunch of randomized drug trials suggests that taking a blood pressure-lowering medication for high blood pressure may reduce the risk of getting a heart attack by 15% and the risk of getting a stroke by about 25%. What a coincidence! A recent study found that we may achieve similar benefits eating just 3 portions of whole grains a day. The observed decrease in systolic blood pressure could decrease the incidence of coronary artery disease and stroke by 15% and 25%, respectively. While whole grains are good, refined grains may not just be neutral. Out of Harvard, white rice, brown rice, and risk of type 2 diabetes. In these 3 prospective cohort studies of U.S. men and women, they found that regular consumption of white rice was associated with higher risk of type 2 diabetes, whereas brown rice intake was associated with lower risk. An interesting wrinkle is that they found other whole grains may be even better than brown rice. Eating white rice was associated with a 17% greater risk of diabetes, replaced with brown, and instead apparently get a 16% drop in risk, and replace white rice with other whole grains, such as oats and barley, a 36% lower diabetes risk. Just a single serving a day of oats and barley may lower our cholesterol. See, whole grains are more than just refined grains with a fiber coat. With white flour, you just get this, but all the rest of the nutrition is stripped away, which includes most of the compounds responsible for whole grain contributions to the health of our bowels, weight, blood sugar, cancer prevention, bones, brain, and heart. The powerful effects of whole grains aren't lost on the food industry marketing teams, who now offer a whole grain guarantee on foods like this. If you remember, plain, cheap, convenient white mushrooms appeared able to outsmart breast cancer cells that try to make their own estrogen by crippling the enzyme tumors use to make it. But this was based on placental tissue samples. Let's stack mushrooms up against the real thing. Human breast cancer cells in a petri dish, if you do nothing, they just keep growing and proliferating at the same rate. But if you add the raw material the cancer cells use to make their own estrogen, they take full advantage and grow like crazy, 10 times as fast. But then, as you add more and more white mushroom extract to shut off estrogen manufacturing, you can get cancer growth almost back to baseline. So, the last study proved mushrooms could inhibit that enzyme, and even figured out which mushroom worked the best. Here, they went a step further to see it in action in actual breast cancer cells. Now that we know it may work, what's the required dose? How many mushrooms do you have to eat? Maybe it's some ridiculous amount. Based on these studies, the consumption of just 5 mushrooms a day may be sufficient to suppress breast tumor growth. Mushrooms appear to work in the lab to suppress breast cancer growth, but what about in the real world? Though breast cancer is the most common cancer among women around the world, the rate in some areas of the world, such as Asia, is up to 6-fold lower than in North America. Maybe it's the green tea and soy? If anything, green tea may only drop risk by about 1/3. Soy works better, but only, it appears, if you start young. Soy intake anytime is associated with decreased breast cancer risk, but the strongest, most consistent effect was for childhood intake, cutting the risk of later breast cancer by as much as half. But if you don't start consuming soy until teens or adulthood, it's only associated with a more kind of green tea type 25-ish% drop in breast cancer risk. The best is actually when we do soy throughout our life, though, as soy intake during childhood and adolescence might provide lifelong protection against breast cancer and sensitize for greater protective effects as an adult. Combined, though, green tea and soy consumption would only account for maybe about a 2-fold difference in breast cancer risk, not 6-fold. So researchers looked into what else Asian women were eating. They already had that intriguing laboratory mushroom data, and so asked 1,000 breast cancer patients how many mushrooms they ate. Then they asked the same question to 1,000 healthy women, who they tried to match the cancer patients as closely as possible, age, height, weight, exercise, smoking status, etc. Based on those answers, they calculated that women who averaged at least a certain daily serving size of mushrooms appeared to drop their odds of getting breast cancer 64%. What was that average serving size? A half a mushroom a day. Who eats half a mushroom? Well, that was averaged over a month. So compared to women who didn't regularly eat any mushrooms, those who ate just 15 or more a month appeared to dramatically lower their risk. Similar protection was found for dried mushrooms. And if you combine mushrooms with green tea, sipping a half a tea bag worth of green tea every day, along with that half a mushroom, was associated with nearly a 90% drop in breast cancer odds. Recently, a study was published of 50,000 African-American women, a sadly neglected demographic when it comes to nutritional science, and medical research in general, actually. Fruit and vegetable intake in relation to risk of breast cancer in the Black Women's Health Study. Those who listened to mom and ate their veggies had significantly lower risk of the nastiest type of breast cancer, estrogen receptor negative, because it's so hard to treat. Any plants particularly protective? Out of all the fruits and vegetables they looked at, 2 stood out above the rest. Which 2 do you think those were? They specifically looked at apples, bananas, broccoli, cabbage, cantaloupe, carrots, collard greens, grapefruit, oranges, spinach, tomatoes, and sweet potatoes. And for those of you thinking, wait a second, you can't compare apples to oranges, well, they just did. What do you think they found? Although broccoli consumption appeared especially protective in premenopausal women, for women of all ages, winner number 1 was collards. No surprise, it's cruciferous, it's a dark green leafy, it's like kale. Right? What's not to like? So, but winner number 2 was a shocker. Carrots, which Tracy featured on the cover of her great book, along with collards. As one researcher suggested, a whole food vegan diet, rich in fruits and vegetables, especially if coupled with regular exercise and smoking avoidance, could be expected to have a remarkably positive effect on African-American cancer risk, reversing the increases in cancer risk incurred during the 20th century. The Black Women's Health Study, which highlighted collards and carrots, was out of Boston University. Across the Charles River, the Harvard Nurses' Health Study also tried to determine which plants were particularly protective in reducing breast cancer risk, and they identified nuts. The intake of fiber in nuts during adolescence and incidence of proliferative benign breast disease, such as fibrocystic breast disease, fibroadenomas, non-cancerous breast lumps, but is considered a marker for increased breast cancer risk. Depending on what biopsies show, it could indicate anywhere between 30% to 1,300% greater risk of going on to develop cancer. Breast cancer can take decades to develop, so they wanted to start early, asking women what their diets were like back in high school. Now, in adults, it's clear, as you can see in this 2012 review, the more fiber you get in your diet, the lower your risk of breast cancer. And same thing, apparently, when you're younger. Women who had the most fiber intake during adolescence, 25% lower risk of this potentially precancerous breast disease. But there's fiber in fruits, vegetables, beans, whole grains, nuts, seeds, all plant foods. Did any class of plant foods stick out? Nuts were found to be particularly protective. 2 servings a week was associated with a 36% lower risk. But that raises the question, which type of nuts, like peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, or do you have to eat true nuts, like almonds, pecans, walnuts, that sort of thing? So just tree nuts or peanuts as well? And the answer is both. Compared to those who rarely ate nuts, those eating just 1 or 2 handfuls a week during high school appeared to drop risk around 30%. In summary, their study observed significant inverse associations between adolescent dietary intake of fiber and nuts and risk of proliferative benign breast disease. Our results provide supportive evidence of the important role of dietary exposures during a unique period in a woman's life in the earlier stage of breast carcinogenesis, the early stage of breast cancer development. These findings, if corroborated, may suggest a viable means for breast cancer prevention. It all started about 15 million years ago. It was the Miocene epoch. Things seemed to be going pretty good until, it seems, 2 flaming meteorites smashed into what's now Germany, with the estimated power of a couple million Hiroshimas. The crater looks quaint now, but at the time there was a mass extinction event wiping many animals out, but not the common ancestor of the great apes, of which we are one, who developed a mutation that may have allowed them to thrive. They lost the ability to detoxify uric acid. Why is that a good thing? Uric acid is naturally produced by the body and may help us hold on to fat, which is good when there's not a lot of food around with the pesky asteroids and all. Also helps us retain sodium, which is good if there aren't a lot of salt shakers out on the savanna, and it helps act chemically as an antioxidant, which is good since green tea hadn't been invented yet. The problem is it's a tightrope. You don't want to have too much in your blood, which may be why other animals retained an enzyme to get rid of the stuff. Fast forward 15 million years. When salt and calories abound, the last thing we need is more sodium and fat retention. But the antioxidant part we like. Unfortunately, not all antioxidant compounds are necessarily good for us. For example, the preservative BHA works by preventing the oxidation of foods, but is reasonably anticipated to be a human carcinogen. Similarly, uric acid is chemically an antioxidant, but when you have too much in your blood, it can crystallize into your joints, a disease called gout, and a high uric acid level may also put us at risk for high blood pressure, stroke, heart disease, diabetes, and death. So, keeping one's uric acid levels low is an important dietary goal. In modern times, we want to keep our uric acid levels as low as possible. How are we going to do that? Well, there are 2 main things that raise your uric acid levels: purines and fructose, which means mostly meat and sugar. Everything from bacon and brains to fish, poultry, shrimp, and veal. And then both sugar and high fructose corn syrup are both about half fructose, which leads to uric acid production in the body. That explains why a spoonful of sugar helps the blood pressure go up, along with the risk of gout in men and the risk of gout in women, and the risk of hypertension, obesity, prediabetes, diabetes, kidney disease, and cardiovascular disease. We went from eating about 4 pounds of added sugars a year to now about 100 pounds per person. It's like a 1/3 pound of sugar a day. And this could be playing a role in the dramatic rise in chronic disease over the last century, as argued in this award-winning recent paper, The Evolution of Obesity: Insights from the Mid-Miocene. Just as you can measure the amount of antioxidants in a cup of apple juice, you can measure the antioxidant level in someone's bloodstream. If you drink that apple juice, within minutes the antioxidant power of your blood starts to rise, you get a nice peak, and then it comes back down. If you drink water, nothing happens, stays the same, down around 10. First, note the scale here. This is in the same units, using the same test as in our 3,000-plus food study. Compared to most foods in the produce aisle, the antioxidant level in our bodies is kind of pitiful. We don't even make it up to iceberg lettuce. Not much better than meat, actually. But then again, meat is what we're made out of. So I guess it's not that surprising. Now, your level does rise a few points when we eat healthy food, so, if you stuff Babe with some blueberries right before you whack them, you may get a healthier pork chop. Apple juice is a long way from blueberries, though, basically just sugar water, fitting in right about here. Hardly even has any vitamin C, so why was there that nice spike in blood antioxidant level drinking some apple juice? Well, it must be the phenolic phytonutrients, but look, we're not talking purple grape juice here, a cranberry pomegranate, we're talking apple. And indeed, when you measure polyphenol levels in the blood, here's what water does compared to 3 types of apple juice. No difference. So what could it be? Turns out you can get a similar spike in antioxidant activity by feeding people essentially straight sugar water. Recently, researchers at the Polish Institute of Fruit and Flower Farming, sounds like a nice place to work, figured it out. It appears to be the uric acid, not the phytonutrients, that are responsible for the rise in blood antioxidant activity after apple juice consumption. Remember, fructose leads to uric acid production, and uric acid, for all the terrible things it does, has some antioxidant activity. So the reason we see this nice spike in antioxidant activity when we drink apple juice is not because we're absorbing antioxidants into our bloodstream. It's not because of a good thing. It's because of all this excess uric acid waste produced when you take in that much sugar. And table sugar is only 50% fructose. High fructose corn syrup, only 55%. The sugar in apple juice is 2/3 fructose, so apple juice in this respect may be even worse than sugar water. Apples themselves are great, but it's not because of the juice in them, but rather, perhaps, primarily what's found in the peel. Within the last year, 6 studies have touted the benefits of apple peels. For example, this one in the Journal of Nutrition and Cancer, the anti-proliferative effects of apple peel extract against cancer cells. We know the more apples we eat, the lower our apparent risk of several cancers. The peels are the really good part, yet are often discarded. For example, apple peel is a waste product of dried apple manufacturing. In one little country, Chile, they throw away 9,000 tons of apple peels a year. It's like 20 million pounds. What a tragedy. So, these researchers decided to see what we're missing. Here are 2 cell lines of human prostate cancer and 2 of human breast cancer, growing merrily away in petri dishes. They're the little black dots you see. They're blissfully unaware that researchers at the University of Wisconsin were at Whole Foods buying some organic Gala apples. The peels were thrown in a blender, and a tiny bit dripped on the unsuspecting cancer cells, and then a bit more and a little more, and as you can see by the end, neither the prostate nor breast cancer cells were very happy about it. Now, this ain't chemo, this is just apple peels. How do they work? Well, to obtain a clue regarding the mechanism, they determine the effect of apple peels on the tumor suppressor protein, MASPin, inside the cancer cells. MASPin is a tumor suppressor gene that has been shown to have tumor suppressor, anti-angiogenic, anti-metastatic properties in both breast and prostate cancer cells. The tumor cells found a way to turn this tumor suppressor gene off, and apple peels apparently turned it back on. An upregulation of this tumor suppressor gene as you add more and more of the apple peel extract to each of the cancer types. They conclude apple peels may possess strong anti-proliferative effects against cancer cells, and they should not be discarded from the diet. Don't forget to subscribe to the free daily videos by signing up at nutritionfacts.org. Don't forget to subscribe to the free daily videos by signing up at nutritionfacts.org.